a massive growth in information across every sector, but it's particularly true in the public sector. It's being driven partly by a better understanding of the customer, citizens, lots of citizen data we're now capturing. It's also coming from activity, so better data about what we're doing, how we're doing it, how to run the services that we're running. But we're also now on the edge of a massive explosion of new information that's going to come from things like sensors, IoT, data from other organizations, which we're going to be able to bring together to get much better market intelligence. And that's where a lot of the value will come from. So the value in having this information, provided it is well structured and easily used, will come from improved decision making, better targeting of resources, delivery of better service at lower cost, empowering employees, for example, to be able to work in a mobile and flexible fashion. So huge opportunity, I think, from information, but the explosion will need to be managed. The CIO, I think, and the name is in, the answer is in the title, Chief Information Officer. The CIO has a real responsibility to make better use of information in the organization. I think that responsibility is in many respects more important than process management and certainly the management of operational IT. But the effectiveness is not just down to the CIO. It will depend on the culture of the organization and the maturity of the organization in understanding what a digital operating model actually means for the business. It's very difficult for a CIO to introduce a DevOps approach effectively, better management of information, adoption of cloud, if the business doesn't understand the implications of that and is not supportive of some of the cultural and procedural changes that are associated with it. And certainly in local government, there are a significant proportion of smaller organizations, district councils, for example, that still make little or no use of technologies and opportunities such as cloud. Information has been a top priority for business and for IT, public and private sector, but particularly in the public sector for a long time. Having said that, it is still a very big untapped opportunity. There is a lot of data, there is a lot of information. Sadly, a lot of it is not structured in a way that allows connections to be made intelligently. There are issues with data quality, there are issues associated with how it's maintained, captured, disposed of, and used. So I think there is a real need for organizations to get a better grip on their information management policies, but also how they expect to use information as part of digital transformation, as part of efficiency and wider change programs. Public sector organizations, as we all know, are facing enormous pressures and challenges. A lot of that is about the financial pressures, the cuts, the lack of money, the reduction in resources. But of course, a lot of it is also associated with growth in demand. An aging population is putting more pressure on particular services such as care and social services. We all expect an awful lot more to be delivered digitally, electronically, self-service, so there is a pressure around digital transformation as well on organizations. But there are other challenges, I think, that we face at the moment. There is an expectation for services to be better joined up around the needs of citizens. That implies, if not shared services, certainly better partnering and sharing of data, along with other challenges such as how do we bring teams together, teams of professionals who are locked into the silos of our different public service organizations, especially locally. How do we bring them together so that they can work in a more collegiate way to provide joined up services to the public? And part of that is around integrating infrastructure, security management, the ability to safely share information in ways that allow services to be designed, delivered and joined up in a more meaningful fashion for the public. If I was to pick three top priorities for the public sector at the moment, the first is unquestionably about streamlining, it's about efficiency, it's about productivity improvements. But there are two others that I think are particularly important. One is about collaboration and sharing. And I don't just mean shared services, I mean partnering with a whole range of organizations, public and private, in order to deliver better services. And within that, there are a whole range of processes and practices which are outdated and need to change to make that possible. We can't simply change what we've done in the past by bolting lots of stuff on top. We need to replumb the way we actually think and the way we design our services in the public sector. So that's the second big challenge. And I think the third one, I would say, is digital. Unfortunately, to some extent, the term digital transformation is becoming overused. But it has a real meaning in terms of describing an organization that has embraced technology opportunity in a new and modern fashion, rather than simply buying more sophisticated IT to do what we've always done, only a little bit better. So I would say my third point would be digital transformation, but defined more precisely than is the case in some organizations at the moment. Digital opportunities are certainly driving some very significant change in the public sector. It's less about the technology. You know, we worry about learning about new technologies and cloud and mobile and flexible working, social media. These are all important, and there are skills, both within IT and of course within the business, associated with how you can exploit those. But the real change is about operating practice. In local government, for example, it affects democracy. The public have a much closer link now to the politicians that represent them through things like social media. Traditional command and control models, hierarchical decision making, is too expensive, it's too slow, and it's not expected or necessary in a world that is underpinned by digital ways of working. So I think the big changes are around behavior, practice, policy, governance, rather than the technology per se. Organizations can harness the power of information, I think, by understanding the assets in the first place. Surveys recently have shown that a very significant proportion of local public services just don't know where all their information actually sits. They certainly don't have, on average, a master data management approach that allows them to manage those assets, understand the quality, and deal with issues that emerge, let alone have an architecture that makes it more straightforward to link related data sets together. That's particularly important for local government and local health service organizations, where there is this increasing pressure to join up services that relate together. And that's often outside our typical organizational silos. So I think the challenge is around having information policy, it's about having information architectures, and it's about having an approach to information management that ensures over time we address the issues of data quality, we can share data responsibly and safely, and we can therefore join up some of our teams and some of our services in ways that make sense for the public. It's an interesting question to try and predict who's going to be responsible for information in our organizations in the future. In the public sector, we've been on a bit of a journey. So we have senior information risk officers, we have data protection officers, you'll have chief information officers. All of these individuals have responsibilities for information, its security, the way it's used. Typically, you'll find that there are people who are responsible for systems data. So the director of social services may be responsible for the quality and the use and the protection of data that sits in the social services system. But I think we can anticipate a future where the potential power, let alone the risk of information, will require a more holistic organizational approach. And I do think there is a need today, let alone one that I think will definitely be fulfilled in the future, for a chief data officer in organizations to look at the opportunity and the risk of data and information and ensure that there is a consistent approach across the whole business to how that is better managed. Local public services and local government must harness the opportunity of new technologies to deal with the challenges that they face. The worry, if I have one, is that it is too easy to simply assume that we need to buy some new clever technology. We need to go to the IT department and expect it to be world class in order to perhaps mask some of the outdated practices that we know and love and don't wish to change within our organizations. And I have some sympathy with that, because the amount of disruption that technology is causing in every organization is huge. And at the moment, with pressure on resources, with the transparency that exists in the public sector, with the need for proper democratic accountability, you've got to be quite careful how you manage change. We cannot have public service organisations failing because they have applied technology in an inappropriate fashion or they've not handled it well. So there are some big opportunities around new technology models. I often talk about cloud and social media, mobile and flexible working tools. These are important, but they need to be set in the context of the way an organisation and a public service organisation will work in the future. That is, for example, much greater self-service. Self-service by employees, by suppliers, by partners, let alone by the public. Much greater automation. And I mean end-to-end automation. I don't mean automating quite a lot of it, but you then have to dip in and do a manual process at the end. We need the public to be able to do much, much more for themselves end-to-end. And we're beginning to see a lot of transactional systems designed in that way. But there's a whole lot more that we could do, especially across organizations. And I think there's also a big challenge around how we can use information to allow services to truly be shared and integrated at a local level. I think it's very much about place and service, certainly for local government. There's a lot of discussion about the risk of cloud models and the risk of adopting cloud solutions. And we have sympathy. I would have sympathy with that. Everyone would have sympathy with that, in as much as you do need to make sure that if you're moving your data off premise, you know where it is, how it's being managed, how can you retrieve it when you need to. Now those are some of the concerns that we hear about with cloud. I have to say, I think some of these are perception. When you ask local government and health if they're using cloud services, a significant proportion of CIOs, IT leaders, CTOs will say, well, we're not using it at the moment. We consider it to be too great a risk. Maybe we don't have sufficient control of our information assets to feel confident about managing data in the cloud. But actually, in practice, it's pretty likely every single public service organization is already using cloud. And the problem is a lot of this is in shadow IT. It's not visible at the center. And unless you've got a proper way of managing your information assets, unless you know where your data sits, what its level of security requirement actually is, where the connectivity lies between different data sets, then you have a real problem. And as a CIO, one of my concerns in moving to cloud was the risk of ending up with a patchwork of cloud services. Every supplier offers cloud solutions. Some are better than others. Some, frankly, are a bit ropey, in my opinion, and you wouldn't want to use them. The product may be great, but the cloud basis on which they're running may not be as resilient and robust as you need. And I would worry about that as a CIO, and I would also worry about the support aspects of that service. If you're going to have a federated and integrated identity management solution for your employees, how does that work with a patchwork of cloud providers? How do you manage the risks associated with data connectivity if you've got integrated systems and only some of them are operating in the cloud? So there's a real pressure on IT departments and CIOs to come up with an information landscape and architecture that makes it very clear when cloud can and indeed should be adopted, and when there should be more caution or due diligence undertaken before a cloud service is actually adopted. Most local authorities are involved in some sort of shared service. Many of those are more cooperative and collaborative arrangements rather than truly deep integrated solutions. But we're seeing more and more genuine shared service models emerging where there is a deep integration of infrastructure, data, systems, teams. In those sort of projects, there is a very significant data risk. And my advice to any organization considering that sort of shared service program is to ensure you have a work stream headed data. What data is impacted? Are there going to be data quality issues? What sort of security do you need? In the post shared service program model, who is going to be responsible for undertaking, I don't know, privacy impact assessments? Who is the data processor? How will all of this work? It is sufficiently important and sufficiently a risk to any shared service program that I really think it needs to be treated as something in its own right. I think it's a real challenge for organizations that provide the tool set and the support for moving to cloud, like Veritas. An organization like Veritas has got some great technologies, and particularly in the information space that we know is going to be important in the future, where there is a lack in many organizations of the tools necessary to manage information, both at the deep technical level, but also in the way it's exploited. So, where does your redundant data sit? Who's responsible for it? How is it managed? And so on. I think the problem, though, and the challenge for organizations supplying services like Veritas is supporting the client in understanding how to use those tools. So I think Veritas needs to work with its partners, with its clients, not just in understanding the tool sets and the sophistication of the tools that Veritas has got, but also working with the CIOs and their team on how can they use that in practice? What do they need to do around information governance, information management, helping them to make the case to the board for why investment in information management is vital to the business in the future. GDPR is a case in point. The general data protection regulations that are coming out of the EU will apply in 2018, will apply to all organizations. At the moment, what I am seeing in the public sector is a lack of awareness in general and a bit of a waiting game in practice. The waiting game comes from questions that I've heard, such as, will it apply? It's an EU regulation. With Brexit, surely we're not going to need to worry about it at all. We've got the Data Protection Act in the UK. Do we need anything else? And the answer to that is, well, my view is absolutely we will need this. It will apply to all organizations that are holding personal data. And many of the aspects of GDPR are very positive in terms of citizens being in more control of their data, more responsibility about how we use that data, how we can identify what we hold and how we hold it, and how we can release it back to the public. But I do think the trick is turning this from seen as a bureaucratic Brussels overhead and another regulation and a bit of red tape into an opportunity to manage our data better. So my view is that there is a role, particularly for CIOs, but also working with legal departments, data protection officers, to support the board in coming up with a coherent plan for GDPR, which looks at the business opportunities, not just a tick box compliance activity. Because many of the things that GDPR expects organizations to do, I think we're going to need to do anyway. If you look at an area like care services, in future, we will need to be in much more control of our care record. We will want to know what organizations are holding about us, and we will expect to be able to make a choice about how that data is shared. Now, for that to happen, you do need more sophistication in your information management. And that lies at the heart, actually, of what GDPR is about. So turn it from a regulation overhead into an information opportunity. Freedom of information requests in local government, in particular, are not seen with relish, and they're not much liked. Not because I think there is a fear of transparency, but because of the overhead that some of the questions entail. It can be quite time-consuming and difficult to answer the questions that are put forward. At a time when resources are incredibly strapped and we're doing so much stuff. So it's sometimes seen as a burden, and I wish we hadn't had that FOI request. The smarter organizations, however, have got better control of their information. They've got better reporting tools, so that responding to a complex FOI request about data, what you do, activity, is that much easier. Also, I think with the Transparency and Open Data Initiative, there's clear opportunities to publish as much information on the web, so that when a request comes along, we say, well, we have one similar to that already. It's all there. We're not answering that one. Go and find it for yourself. And I think that puts the boot on the other foot, so to speak. One other thing I would say, and it's a plea really for the professional organizations that are using FOI, the suppliers, the press, academia, do think about the questions that you're asking. Try and ask questions that are answerable. Try and ask questions in a way that it's clear what you're trying to understand, because that helps public service organisations to respond as efficiently as possible to what you need as a member of the press, a journalist, a supplier, or a university trying to get useful information.